She didn't raise her glass to our son. She raised it to herself. "We've come to a loving decision to part ways," Delia said, her fingers still resting lightly on my shoulder. "This new chapter is something we're both ready for." The rooftop went silent. Forks hovering midair, wine paused at lips, 50 witnesses suspended between disbelief and discomfort. I didn't flinch. I simply stood. "To Miles," I said, lifting my own glass, "always lead with clarity, even when those around you don't." Then I placed a leather folio on Delia's dinner plate and walked away. The smell of white peonies mingled with the scent of seared duck and rain-soaked limestone. A storm had passed earlier, leaving the air heavy and electrically alive. My shoes clicked against the slate tiles as I crossed the rooftop, measured, deliberate. No one called after me. I didn't need them to. Their silence was its own theater. Miles didn't move. I caught one last glimpse of him as I reached the stairwell, his eyes flicking from me to his mother, his lips parted, jaw clenched. The boy I'd raised on Saturday pancakes and late-night project rescues. The boy who now had to understand the man I was without apology. As the door shut behind me, muffling the ambient chatter that had just resumed with an unnatural forced levity, I let out a long, quiet breath. My hand brushed against the iron railing on the stairs, cold, slick with rain. I steadied myself on it, not from weakness, but to feel something grounded. 3 months earlier, I had no plan to dismantle my marriage, but betrayal rarely gives you that luxury. It starts as a grain of discomfort, a laugh that lingers too long after a name is mentioned, a calendar appointment that doesn't match a location, the sense that you're being humored instead of heard. It was late February when something first caught my eye. Delia returned from a conference in D.C. with a brochure in her briefcase that didn't match her itinerary. I had picked up her dry cleaning, like I often did. As I slipped the hanger into her side of the closet, a glossy pamphlet fell from the pocket of her blazer. Solar Forward, Community-Driven Climate Innovation. Harmless enough, except Delia hadn't mentioned attending any session by that name. Revlon wasn't listed among the sponsors, and I should have remembered if it had been. I review sustainability grant allocations for a living. I didn't bring it up. Not right away. We were eating dinner the next night. Saffron risotto, her favorite, one of the few dishes I still cooked. I'd barely finished grating the Parmesan when she glanced at her phone, smiled faintly, then tucked it face down by her wine. "That D.C. trip," I said. "Did you speak anywhere?" She shook her head, too quickly. "Just panel listening, nothing major." No eye contact, no follow-up, just a shrug and a sip of wine. Another shift came 2 weeks later. I was preparing our tax documents, early as always. We use the same preparer every year, but Delia had submitted her 1099 separately this time, citing confidential advisory expenses tied to investor engagement. I'd seen those phrases before. They're used to sanitize irregularities in city vendor audits. I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't need to. I live by a rule in my profession. If the patterns talk, listen. At first, I didn't let myself believe it. This was Delia, the woman I met during a sustainability roundtable, the woman who once cried while reading a story about misallocated hurricane relief funds, the woman who taught our son to identify invasive plant species by leaf shape. But something had shifted. It wasn't just secrecy. It was the erosion of shared values. The language changed. Everything was image, optics, positioning. At home, she was often distracted, glancing at emails during dinner, stepping out mid-call and returning with a vague smile. I remember the last time I felt something like hope. We were sitting at the breakfast bar, me in my worn cable-knit sweater, her in a silk blouse, already late for the office. Miles had just emailed us both a picture, him standing beside his capstone project, smiling wide. Delia looked at it and said, "This is why we stayed together this long." It wasn't a compliment. It was a slip. That night, I pulled out a manila folder I hadn't touched in years. Our post-nuptial agreement, signed 10 years ago after Delia secured her first major investor round. A safeguard, she'd said, in case of a scandal. She meant one to me. She didn't foresee her own. I started running comparisons. Corporate payments linked to consulting firms that didn't have proper filings. Revelion's external carbon audits done by newly formed LLCs with directors connected to Sasha Graves, Delia's VP of Communications. Sasha, who had just posted a picture from a penthouse overlooking River North. The dots weren't just connecting, they were pulsing. That's when something hardened in me. Not rage, not even grief, just a single crystalline thought. I will not lie in front of my son. So I didn't. I built a sealed, notarized report, cited precedents, linked transfer patterns, added annotations referencing municipal ethics codes. I submitted it through a private channel available only to vetted whistleblowers. The system would review it silently, until it couldn't. Tonight, Delia made her move first. She thought it was power. It was actually performance. And I handed her the real script, tied in a leather folio, placed like a final course. What would you do if the person closest to you deceived you and smiled while doing it? I didn't go home after the rooftop dinner. I walked 4 blocks in the dark and sat on a bench overlooking the lake, the city behind me glittering like it had nothing to hide. The folio was gone, delivered. Delia's smile still burned in my memory. That calm confidence when she dropped the announcement like it was some benevolent gift, a mercy. We'd raised a son together. We'd built careers side by side. And still, she chose to make the betrayal a performance. In front of Miles. In front of people who respected us. That was when the silence began to feel strategic. Her shift in tone, the tighter grip on her calendar, the jokes she no longer explained. She hadn't just grown distant. She'd started living a separate life within ours, assuming I'd never ask the right questions. I got up and started walking. It wasn't until the next afternoon that I returned to the apartment. The lakefront breeze had dried the sweat on my shirt. When I unlocked the front door, the space was exactly as we'd left it. Delia's handbag still perched on the foyer table, her heels aligned beneath the bench. A faint scent of her perfume hung in the hallway, something expensive and citrusy, the same one she'd worn the day we closed on this place. I walked to the kitchen. The sink was empty. Her favorite glass sat upside down on a drying mat, bone-thin crystal, etched with a barely visible crest from an investor gala. I picked it up, stared through it. Then I opened the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one where we kept old tax returns, house deeds, and utility account folders. I didn't have a search warrant. I didn't need one. These were our papers, our finances. But somewhere deep in my chest, something clenched as I moved documents around. I wasn't just searching. I was bracing. And there it was. A printout of a 2022 charitable deduction form. $87,000, listed under External Sustainability Partnerships. I hadn't signed that version. It wasn't in our joint files. The attached letter, clearly scanned from Revelion letterhead, cited a donation to Solar Forward, the same group I'd stumbled across in the DC pamphlet. The letter bore Delia's digital signature. That night, I called someone I trusted. Martha Ellison had been a financial analyst at the Office of Public Partnerships for 16 years. She was sharp, principled, and had a memory like a ledger. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you recall a group called Solar Forward?" "Should I?" she asked. "They've been getting secondary grants through the Metro Sustainability Fund, supposedly community outreach, but the filings are lean." There was a pause. Then, "They're not in the system directly, but they're mentioned in a subgrant memo from last fall. Why?" "I found something. Not sure yet." "You're never unsure without reason," she said. "What do you need?" "Nothing official, just a second set of eyes." Martha agreed to meet the next morning at a corner cafe in Old Town, neutral territory. She arrived wearing her usual navy wool coat, hair pulled back, eyes alert. I slid the folder across the table. These are excerpts from our personal tax returns. Compare them to this donation letter. She read slowly, lips pursed. This letter shouldn't exist, she finally said. This group wasn't formally listed in Revelyon's Q3 disclosures, at least not under this name. What if it's a shell? I asked. She nodded. Possible, especially if funds were routed through advocacy intermediaries. That's how a lot of image-based environmental efforts blur lines, makes it hard to trace accountability. And if Revelion received public-linked funds, then any misallocation could qualify as conduct affecting public confidence, she finished, which meant the State Ethics Commission would have jurisdiction, not just financial auditors, not just shareholders. I sat back. The cafe had grown louder, but around us the sound dropped out. It was as if we were sealed in a bubble of slow realization.
"You think she's in on it?" Martha asked. "I think she was sloppy enough to leave her prints." We left it there. I didn't want speculation. I wanted clarity. But as I walked back to the apartment, I knew one thing with certainty. Delia hadn't been careful because she never thought I'd look. She'd mistaken trust for blindness. And now, even if she tried to spin it as technical error, the patterns were no longer private. That night, I opened a drawer in my home office and removed a framed photo. The three of us, at Miles's high school graduation. Delia's arms around both of us, her eyes lit by a pride that now felt transactional. I placed the photo face down in the drawer and quietly locked it. Not as punishment, as a way of telling myself, this chapter is no longer reference material. That weekend, I visited Miles at his campus apartment. He didn't bring up the rooftop dinner directly, but after coffee he said, "Was that your decision too?" I looked at him for a long moment. "No." He nodded. "Did you know?" "I suspected things. I didn't want to believe them." He looked down. "I just wish I hadn't found out that way." "I know." We didn't talk much after that, but before I left, he handed me a folder. "What's this?" "It's my thesis draft. I wasn't going to show it to anyone yet." I opened the first page. The title, Sustainability Optics, When Green Turns Gray. Miles gave me a tight, unreadable smile. "You might find the third chapter interesting." When I got home, I read it, and there it was, a full critique of Revelation's overseas carbon trade partnerships, including allegations of greenwashing. Not personal, just factual. He'd written it before the rooftop. He'd already been watching her too. By Sunday, I had a new file forming on my desk, not as a husband, as an ethics officer, a new folder labeled in clean black ink. Revelation, conflicted disclosures. No dates, no accusations, just patterns. And in the middle of the night, as I stood in the darkened kitchen sipping water, I heard the front door open. Delia. Her heels clicked on the hardwood, slow, precise. She didn't say anything until she saw me leaning against the counter. "You didn't have to embarrass me," she said, barely above a whisper. I studied her for a moment. "You mean by telling the truth?" "I gave you dignity," she said. "I could have made this messy." I set the glass down. "You made it public. I made it honest." A long pause stretched between us. Then she crossed to the liquor cabinet, poured herself something dark and expensive. "You're not built for this kind of war, Jonas." I didn't answer. I just watched her take a sip and walk past me into the hall. She didn't ask where I'd been, didn't ask if I knew. And I realized then, she didn't want to know what I had. She wanted to believe I wouldn't use it. That was her mistake. Could you look someone in the eye knowing they betrayed you? The elevator opened to silence. No music, no voices, just the soft mechanical hum of the doors parting. I stepped into the penthouse apartment and set my keys on the console with a sound louder than expected. They clattered against the marble, startling in the stillness. Delia was seated by the window, facing the lake, glass of wine untouched on the table beside her.
She didn't turn. Just said, "So we're doing this now?" The wind outside pressed against the tall panes, low and rhythmic, like distant waves trying to reach us. I walked across the room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. "I read the fund disclosures," I said, "and the partnership filings." Still, she didn't move. "You used Solar Forward to move private incentives through a publicly supported channel, and you masked them under environmental outreach." Finally, Delia looked at me. Her face was calm, too calm, the kind of composure you only wear when you think emotion is a weakness. "I didn't falsify anything," she said. "There were no criminal entries." "Not yet," I said. "But your language was careful. Too careful." I sat across from her. A sharp click echoed between us as her wineglass shifted slightly on the marble from the movement. "There's a recording," I continued, "of you and Sasha laughing about the travel reimbursements. You called them carbon vacations." Delia blinked, just once. Then her expression hardened. "Do you know what happens when a woman like me is accused publicly by a man, especially her husband?" "I didn't make it public. You did," I said quietly, "the night you tried to script our divorce as a mutual branding moment." That was the moment her mask cracked. Not all the way, but enough. She reached for the glass and took a sip. But her hand shook. Just barely. Enough that the wine grazed her lip instead of her mouth. "You've submitted a report," she said, voice low. "I can feel it." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You think you're the righteous one here. But you know what this looks like from the outside? A bitter husband trying to punish his successful wife for leaving him." I stood slowly, my chair scraping slightly against the floor. "You didn't just leave," I said. "You lied. You smiled through it. You tried to turn Miles's graduation into a soft landing for your guilt." Delia stood too now. The distance between us suddenly felt exact, measured in years of restraint, of dismissed instincts, of silences I'd convinced myself were just stress. "I have a board meeting in 2 days," she said. "If this leaks before that—" "It's already under inquiry," I said. "Internal audit was triggered by an anonymous source, but the commission has the report, and they're asking for records." She stepped back, one heel catching slightly on the edge of the rug, a shift that almost made her stumble, but didn't. Delia Monroe never stumbled, not where anyone could see. Then she laughed, not amused, not angry, hollow. "You really did it," she said. "You brought down your own house." "No," I said. "I'm just not willing to live in a house built on someone else's illusion." Silence stretched between us again. "I never thought you'd act," she finally said. "I thought you'd sulk, maybe leave. But this?" "This," I said, walking toward the hallway, "is called accountability." At the door, I paused and turned. Her silhouette was framed by the lake behind her, silver ripples catching the light. "I'm staying at a colleague's place downtown. I'll return for essentials later in the week." "You're leaving?" she asked, stunned now, as if that part hadn't occurred to her. I nodded. "This isn't a negotiation anymore, Delia. I'm not your understudy." Her breath caught. Just once. She didn't try to stop me. As I left, I caught the faintest sound behind me, the hollow drop of something small hitting the marble. I didn't turn around. It wasn't until later that I realized it was the wineglass. 2 days later, Revillion's press office issued a quiet statement. The company was undergoing a voluntary review of internal procedures. Sasha's name disappeared from the leadership page. Delia's calendar was cleared of public appearances. But the damage had already begun. Colleagues whispered. Board members paused before replying to her emails. And Miles? He didn't call her. He called me. "I heard from a friend interning at Revillon," he said. "There's an emergency audit." "Yes." "You had something to do with it?" "I submitted facts to the proper channels." Silence. Then, I don't know how to feel. You don't have to yet. He exhaled slowly through the phone. You okay? I'm not angry anymore, I said. Just clear. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, she lied to us. I know. That night, I returned to the apartment just once, to gather my things. I didn't announce it. I didn't call ahead. Delia wasn't home. I packed quietly, essentials only. Files, clothes, the copy of Miles's thesis he'd printed for me. On my way out, I passed the dining table, the place we'd once hosted friends, birthdays, anniversaries. In the center sat the leather folio I'd left on her plate, still unopened. I paused. Then I picked it up, walked to the fireplace, and set it neatly on the mantel. I didn't need it anymore, but I wanted it visible. When she came home, she'd see it, not out of spite, out of honesty. She'd tried to script my silence. I'd rewritten the ending. Would you dare to speak the truth to the face of someone who betrayed you?
I didn't expect Martha to visit in person. She arrived unannounced, late afternoon, her coat damp with sleet and a manila envelope tucked beneath her arm. We hadn't seen each other since the cafe meeting. Now she stood in the doorway of the coach house I was renting, a small, sunlit space near campus with creaking floors and no history. I came straight from the office, she said. You should see this. Inside, she laid the documents on the kitchen table. Memos, internal emails, a flagged transaction report from Revalone's senior accountant, one I hadn't known existed. It noted a questionable payout linked to Solar Forward and had been time-stamped 2 months before the rooftop dinner. I thought this kind of documentation would have triggered a deeper audit, she said. It should have, I replied, scanning the highlighted lines, unless someone buried it. Martha looked at me, her voice low. The system is bending around her, still. I nodded, then folded the papers and slid them back into the envelope. Not for much longer. After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on knees, the evening pressing in around me. The radiator clicked to life, uneven, hissing warmth that made the silence feel more personal. I looked at my phone. No messages from Miles, no calls from Delia. I scrolled through old photos, the three of us on vacation, a shot of Delia on stage at a sustainability summit, applauding the keynote speaker. Miles as a teenager, arms crossed but smiling. I almost closed the gallery, but stopped. One image stood out. A photo taken a year ago at a fundraiser Delia hosted. She'd insisted I attend, even though I'd felt out of place. In the image, she's laughing with donors. I'm behind her, slightly blurred, half-cropped, like a stranger at the edge of the frame. That night, I made my decision. The next morning, I called an old colleague at the Civic Integrity Forum. I hadn't spoken to Rachel in 2 years, but she answered on the second ring. "Jonas," she said, surprised, "you're alive." I need a quiet panel slot, no PR, just truth. She paused. "You're ready to speak?" I'm ready to name the cost of staying silent. 3 days later, I sat in a modest auditorium at a civic forum in Hyde Park, one of the city's lesser-known public ethics events. No cameras, no media, just 40 people seated in rows, listening to a series of short addresses on municipal transparency and corporate overlap. I was the final speaker. No title attached to my name, just advisor, private capacity. I stood, took the podium, and exhaled. I've worked in financial ethics for nearly 20 years, I began, and for most of that time, I believed systems only failed when bad people ran them. I no longer believe that. I didn't mention Delia. I didn't need to. I described patterns of concealment, of funds routed through advocacy masks, of reputations built on engineered narratives. I described how silence becomes compliance. Then I said, accountability is not a verdict. It's an act of respect for the public trust. A long silence followed. Then quiet applause, not explosive, but genuine. That was my sacrifice. I knew Delia's circle would hear about it. I knew former colleagues might see it as betrayal. But I also knew
I could no longer occupy the shadows of someone else's truth. After the panel, Rachel approached me. "You know this will circulate," she said gently. "I'm counting on it." That night, I received a message from Miles. "Saw the speech. I'm not sure I agree with everything, but I'm glad you spoke. You sounded like yourself." The next day, Delia called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Her voice was tight. "I heard about the panel. You made this public, Jonas. Don't pretend you didn't." I saved the message, then deleted her number. That afternoon, Revelyon's board released a statement. They were conducting an expanded review of the solar forward funding model and pausing all related operations. A colleague from the city office forwarded me a memo. Delia was being placed on temporary leave. It hadn't been an expose. It hadn't been a press war. It had been truth, spoken softly but unavoidably. That evening, I returned to the apartment for the last time. I had arranged for a moving service to pack what remained, but I wanted to collect one thing myself. The photo from Miles's graduation. It still sat on the hallway shelf. As I reached for it, I noticed something new. A post-it stuck to the glass. Delia's handwriting. Just 2 words. "You win." I pulled the note off, crumpled it, dropped it in the trash without a word. Winning had never been the point. As I stepped outside, snow had begun to fall. Light, dry flakes catching in my hair and coat. I stood for a moment, letting it settle. Then I walked away. How far would you go to reclaim your dignity? 6 weeks after the ethics panel, the news broke. The Tribune ran a front-page article. "Whistleblower report spurs Revelion CEO's resignation amid ethics inquiry." Delia's photograph was smaller than usual, cropped tightly, no smile. The piece was restrained, factual, devastating. It cited the State Corporate Conduct Commission's investigation, mentioned questionable financial relationships between grant recipients and executive-level decision-makers, and noted that Delia Monroe had voluntarily stepped down. They used her full name. No softened language, no redemption arc. That morning, I sat at a quiet cafe near my new office. The space was small, just a single room with tall windows and a view of a rusted fire escape. But it was mine. I ran my fingers along the edge of the newspaper, the grain of recycled newsprint catching faintly on my thumb. Across from me, Martha sipped her coffee and nodded once. "They buried it as long as they could," she said. "But when Sasha resigned last week, the board had no choice." "She knew," I said. "She always knew," Martha replied. "She just didn't think it would cost her." That evening, I opened the windows of the coach house and let in the spring air. The scent of fresh-cut grass and distant charcoal grills drifted in, quiet reminders that life was happening all around, unshaken by scandal. I placed the last box on the shelf beside the others. Books, framed awards, notes from past clients. No photos this time. No symbols of a life that no longer belonged to me. On the desk sat a new folder, one I had written from scratch. ESG Conduct Standards, Draft for Civic Compliance Model. It would be my next contribution, an ethical blueprint to help other cities separate legitimate environmental investment from greenwashing theater. This time, I wasn't working behind someone else's name. The divorce was finalized quietly, 2 weeks after the board statement. Delia's attorneys pushed for a private resolution. The postnuptial agreement held. I kept the lakefront property, 2/3 of our joint investments, and full control of my pension and deferred earnings. Delia retained her pre-investment shares and exited with what she protected. Her name would no longer appear on Revelion's legal filings, nor on any of its funded initiatives. There were no courtroom dramatics, no last-minute declarations, just signatures. And silence. I sent the final confirmation to Miles. His reply came quickly. "I read the article. I'm glad you stood your ground, and I'm glad it's over." He visited the coach house the next weekend. We shared lunch, grilled vegetables, cold lemonade. The table was smaller than the one we'd used at the apartment, but it felt more honest. No performance, no staging. As we finished eating, he stood and walked to the shelf. His hand hovered over a blank picture frame. "You're not putting any photos up?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not yet." He thought for a moment, then took out his phone and handed it to me. "Then take this one, just us." The photo showed him smiling, seated across from me, the table between us. Sunlight framed the edge of his shoulder. I'd captured the moment he didn't know I needed. That evening, I printed it and placed it in the frame. One photo, one new beginning. 2 days later, I received a letter, actual paper, with my name handwritten in Delia's familiar script. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sentence. "I never thought you'd follow through." No apology, no explanation, just that. I folded the paper, set it on the counter, and reached for a lighter from the drawer. I held the corner to the flame and watched it curl at ash over the sink. Not out of anger, out of finality. The next week, the ethics board invited me to consult full-time on structural reform. I accepted, with one condition. My role would remain advisory, and I would not be listed as a public liaison. "I'm done being the name behind the face," I told them. Instead, I would build frameworks, real ones, quiet ones, the kind that outlast headlines. The last piece of furniture I assembled for the coach house was a small wooden bench by the front door. I built it myself, late on a Sunday afternoon, with the windows open and music playing softly. The wood was old pine, repurposed from a table Delia and I had once chosen together. I cut it down, sanded the finish, gave it a new form. As I drove the last nail, the sharp, clean sound echoed in the empty space. It didn't hurt. It didn't remind me of loss. It sounded like a beginning. How far would you go to reclaim your dignity? Ever rebuilt yourself from betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below.